Before we go on to talk to some local candidates who've been running this year for elections, we want to reach out to Mike Feinstein, who's kind of a guru when it comes to election and has been tracking and following the elections throughout the country, if not the world, for a long time for the Greens. Now, Mike is actually a co-founder of the Green Party of California, and he's served in a variety of roles since then in California and in Los Angeles and state. I think his biggest claim to fame, though, is that he's actually from Minnesota, like me. No, just kidding. His biggest claim to fame is that he was elected to the Santa Monica City Council twice in 1996 and in 2000, and he was unanimously appointed its mayor from 2000 to 2002. He's also written a book on the European Green parties, and he just has a wealth of knowledge. I think he did a radio show. He's many articles, and we're really lucky to have him here. He's going to kind of set the stage, talk about the Greens in terms of the federal races in the state, and then look at the local, which is really where the Greens have done the most, is at the local side. So, Mike, can you say hi and join us?
Thank you, Cam. Thank you, Margaret. And I'm going to talk a bit about the electoral context of our Green Party, our record over history, and set the stage for the candidates that we're going to hear soon afterwards. Most of us are familiar that there are super majorities of voters who want more political parties and political options. It polls well over 60%. And how does the Green Party fit into that? A lot of people think the Greens only run for president. That's not correct. We actually run on all sorts of levels, from the lowest municipal level all the way up to governor, U.S. Senate, etc. And in our history, over 6,600 Greens have run for elected office since 1985, which was the first time we ran. And we've had at least 1,418 Greens elected. You usually don't hear about that. You just hear about Greens running for president. And what has been that breakdown of the races that we've run for? Because again, people often say, oh, they're only running for the highest level offices. Of all those 6,600 plus races, we've had 825 for federal office, 1,677 for state office, and together that's almost 38%. But about 62% of those races have been for local office. So the reality is that we have had a focus mostly on local office, but we've also run for some of the higher level. Why do we run for some of those higher level offices? For federal office, we can communicate with large numbers of voters. We can address federal policy, and we can gain or retain ballot status for our party in some states where the result in the U.S. Senate race is one of the ways that we can qualify. So for U.S. Senate, of all of our races in our history, we have run about 140 times. And the best result we had was in 1992, Linda Martin in Hawaii, who was one of the co-founders of the Green Party in Hawaii, got almost 14% of the vote. And this was really remarkable. She beat the Libertarian, finished very close behind the Republican. For the U.S. House, the best we've done in two-way races, we've had a couple of times where they've been two-way races. The best we've done against a Republican head-on has been in Arizona, Mark Salazar, 31.4% in 2016. And then the best result we did against the Democrat was Kenneth Mejia in the Los Angeles area. A couple of years back in 2018, he got 27.5%. So we've done pretty well in some of those U.S. House races. And then for the state level, there are additional reasons to be running there. Of course, again, it's an opportunity when we run for state office to communicate with large numbers of voters, to address issues of state policy, and then in particular, to get our ballot status and to retain our ballot status. The laws that have been passed by Democrats and Republicans make it really tough for us to be on the ballot. They have a monopoly on power. They set the rules, and those rules are set up to exclude us from participating. And what that means is we often have to run for statewide office in order to retain ballot status, and in particular for governor. So in this country, we've run 127 times for governor. Our best results, twice we've been over 10%. Once in 1994 in New Mexico, Roberto Mondragon got 10.4%, and that was in a three-way race with both a Democrat and a Republican. Almost that same amount, 10.36, Rich Whitney in Illinois, also against both the Democrat and the Republican. And the first time we ever qualified for the ballot was in Alaska in 1990. And that year, Jim Sykes, an Alaskan Green, we needed 3% of the vote to get a ballot status. He got 3.3%. Now, I mentioned the fact that we run for these offices because it's hard for us to get ballot status and to retain ballot status, and in part because the Democrats and Republicans often say you have to get a certain percentage of the vote only running for governor. What our Green Party national platform talks about in terms of ballot access is that, and I have that here on this screen, is that we don't think it should only be for governor where we can keep ballot status, because voters are less likely to cast a vote for a minor party when it's at the top of the ticket. They're a little more likely sometimes for a little more of a down ticket race, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, controller, treasurer, etc. So our position as a party is to make it easier for parties to qualify via any statewide race, not just for governor. And often the Democrats and Republicans say you have to get this percentage of the vote every 2 years, so that you have to get it both for governor and then for president. We think it should just be for every 4 years, because we think giving voters more choice is really in the interest of democracy. In state legislatures, we run, here you see over 1,200 times for state legislature, for state senate, and the lower house. That's been almost 20% of all of our races. In state senate, we've gotten as high as 38%, Ann Gleason in New Mexico, 37%, Joel Cypress in Minnesota, 30%, Jeff Toast in Rhode Island. And those, one of them was in a two-way race, but even in Toast race, that was both a Democrat and Republican. In the lower houses, state assembly, state house of representatives, etc., we've actually won 5 races. And that in part is because often those districts are a little bit smaller. It's a little bit easier for us to win. In the first 2 cases where we've won in Arkansas there, we had an interesting situation where Fred Smith in Arkansas was a Green, and the Democratic candidate against him had been convicted of a conspiracy to commit election fraud. And right before the election, we sued so that his votes wouldn't be counted because he couldn't serve in office. So we got 100% of the vote in that race. And then there was another time in Arkansas, Richard Carroll in 2008, where the Democrats screwed up and didn't get enough signatures to get on the ballot. There was only a write-in campaign. So those 2 races we won without a lot of competition. More interesting in some ways in the state of Maine, John Eder, who got elected in 2002, he got elected, and these are much smaller districts in Maine because they have a large number of people in their state legislature and a small population. He got about 2/3 of the vote, got elected to the state legislature, and then it came time for redistricting. What did the Democrats do? They redistricted him out of his district to try and get him out of the legislature. So what he then did is he moved 4 blocks back into his old district, and he won the race and kind of showed the Democrats you can't pull that kind of nonsense. So he was elected twice in Maine, and then once in California in a special election back in 1999. Adi Bach won head-on with a Democrat. So then let's switch over to local races, which is really the tofu of Greens running for office in this country. We've had, I mentioned before, about 62% of all of our races that we've run, and we've won over 1/3 of them. Over 1,400 times we've won for local office, a 35% winning percentage. And that winning percentage, by the way, when you subtract out, as with any party, there are some candidates who are just marginal. They run, they really don't have anything going. But if you look at our more serious candidates, it's an even higher percentage of that. And among those 1,400, about 170 have been in local partisan races, where states have the local races that are partisan. Most of the country local races are not partisan. And we're talking about county, municipal, school boards, special districts. And when we run, what's the difference about when we run in local communities? We run in local communities because there you can run based on your community activism, your record in the community, the issues that you've worked on. It's also easier to win those races because you don't need the kind of big money that you do for higher level state and federal office. And also, voters are more willing to take a chance on minor party candidates in down ticket races. And what's so important about this? There's a couple of key reasons why our Green Party strategy is so important. There have been a lot of efforts to try and launch left of center minor parties in this country. In the early 1990s, you had the Labor Party advocates, the New Party, the 21st Century Party, which was going to be started by the National Organization for Women, and more recently, in recent years, the People's Party. And they've been more top-down models. You also look at the Reform Party, which built around Ross Perot. He ran, and then they disappeared when he was done as a candidate. Our bottom-up electoral strategy of running in local races to build a base is not dependent on top-down celebrity-based models. And that's why we still exist as a Green Party today when these other parties have gone away. And some of the advantages of doing that is, number one, when you run for local office, and you get elected, you can show that not only do voters think we have good ideas, but that we can actually govern. Because it's nice to say you're for this and that, but people in communities, if they see how when you're part of the system and you're in the government and you can be effective, that you can govern, that gives the idea that you're an actual credible political party. Also, Green parties in the rest of the world have been winning state and federal office because they are operating mostly under systems of proportional representation, where unlike the US winner-take-all system, where you run individual single-seat district by district, other countries you run in multi-seat districts, and if a party gets 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats. That's part of the Green Party platform, our electoral reform platform, and if we get elected to local office, then we can say, look, we can govern. We are successful in advancing the public interest, and the only reason we aren't in office on higher levels is because of the electoral system. So that gives a lot of strength to our arguments to reform the system. It's also the case, I mentioned before, that most of our local wins have been in nonpartisan races. It's still significant when we win there, because when you choose to be a member of a smaller minor party, the big parties turn on you. There isn't the institutional support, there isn't the money, there aren't the endorsements. And these are people who are choosing to align themselves with a minor party and accept those consequences and still go ahead and run and win. So that base in local races is really strong. Well, let's look at a couple of the different types of races that we've run in locally and see how we've done. First, county legislative. We often talk about those as board of supervisors or along that sort of type of name. So almost 10% of all the races that we've run in our history have been for county legislature. And we've won about 20% of them, 125. That's a pretty good record. And among those, the longest serving one in northwestern Wisconsin in Douglas County across on Lake Superior, David Conley served for 32 years from 1986 to 2018. And a lot of those local county races were in Wisconsin. For mayor, we've run 254 times and had 35 elected. And there are also appointed mayors. I was an appointed mayor, for example, in Santa Monica. So the first Green who got elected as a mayor came out of that same idea of Greens coming out of community-based activism. Kelly Weaverling in Cordova, Alaska, was one of the main activists when that horrible Exxon Valdez oil spill happened. Some of you remember that in the late 80s. Well, Kelly was one of the people out there trying to work on the cleanup, to clean up the beaches, to save the animals. And he turned that record of activism into being elected as mayor in his town. The longest serving mayor is in California, Bruce Delgado, up in Marina. That's just a little bit north of Big Sur, for those of you who know the coast of California. And by the end of his current term, he'll have been in the office for 16 years. City council is probably where we've run the most local races. In fact, it is 1,457, 22% of all our races, and over a third of all of our local races. Sometimes they're called city councils, sometimes town councils, borough councils, etc. Out of that, we've won over 25%, 381 of those, all over the country, and we've had a lot of incumbents. Our re-election rate with our incumbents for city council has been well over 80%. The longest serving Greens there, again, showing that once you're in office, if the voters are willing to return you to office, it shows that your Green policies and your ability to govern is convincing. 3 different Greens have served for 16 years. Donna Spring in Berkeley, Cam Gordon, who is our co-host tonight in Minneapolis, which is also one of the largest cities that we've ever elected any Greens to a city council. San Francisco is another one of those. And then Alan Drusis in rural Yucaipa, California. Another thing that speaks to Greens believing that we can govern well is the fact that we've actually had city and town council majorities in several occasions in several places around the country. So not only do they think an individual Green is exciting, but the idea that Greens can control the majority on a city council and the voters return them is also a big, big statement in favor of how we do once we're in office. So you see here in Arcata, which is up in Humboldt County in California, we had 2 different city council majorities, Fairfax, California, which is just north of San Francisco, and Sebastopol, which is also north of Sebastopol, and in New York State in New Paltz. So 5 different places we've had those kind of majorities. And then let's look at a couple other local races. For school board, that's the second most that we run. So city council and school board are the core places, the whole wheat bread and olive oil that you would say for where our local based strategy comes from. And out of there, over 500 races we've run, 13% of all of our local races, and almost half of them we've won. So when you remove the marginal candidates from there, we've got probably about 50% of our wins running for school board. And there's a lot of progressive policies that you can bring into play on a school board. So it's a very important place for Greens to run. Again, we've had a 16-year-long incumbent there in Northern California, Carolyn Dixon in Santa Rosa. Then what are special districts? Special districts are places like water boards, library boards, park and rec boards, etc. Those kind of special districts are another place where Greens have done very well. 400 times we've run for those races in our history, almost 60% winning percentage. And again, that's a kind of race that not only can you run for and win and get elected to, but then you can jump from those kind of races onto a city council as well. They're a good place to go ahead and lay out your record of how you're doing for the community and then go from there. And the longest running Green there is on the Parks and Recreation Commission in Minneapolis, which actually I think has the highest rate. Cam can help us with that later. I think it's like the #1 ranked park system in the entire United States. And Annie Young was on that for 23 years. So in total, how many Greens hold elected office? We are the 4th largest party in the United States after the Democrats, Republicans, and Libertarians in terms of holding elected office. These are the totals for the most recent years. Currently, we have 146 Greens holding elected office. You see, over the last 5 years, we've had a high of 164, a low of 138. A lot of times it depends on people who maybe have served 2 or 3 terms. They don't run again. It kind of varies back and forth, but we've been more or less around this sort of number. The high total for us was back in 2003. We had a lot of momentum from the Nader campaign and a lot of people ran for us. Now, in those days, it was actually easier it's easier today to actually identify some of these registered Greens than back in those days, because back then we didn't have electronic databases. So the reality is we probably even had more Greens holding elected office back in those days. But here we are. And I do have to say that one of the reasons our numbers have gone down a bit since those days is that a lot of the people who used to decide to come into the Green Party as a minor party have been going into the Democrats as a result of the Bernie Sanders campaign, who tried to convince people that that's a better place to go. And a lot of local elected officials who we had changed their registration to vote for him in the primaries. And that's something that is really a function of our winner-take-all system, which brings too many people into the dead-end major parties, and instead of spreading out under the minor parties, which is why we work for electoral reform. So those are kind of the a base overview of how we've done. And just to close, the reality is we exist as a party because we run for local office and we get elected, and we're not going away. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. That was really informative presentation. I have a couple of questions about it. And I know you spent some time elaborating on some of the points, and I appreciate that. But one of the things that you touched on, and I think this is a very vital point, is this sort of conception that the public has that Greens are always just running every 4 years for president, right? Like that's a big thing all of our local candidates face. And it's obviously a spurious contention against us, but I think this kind of presentation showing our local candidates how we win and all the rest is really great because it really counterbalances the narrative that we're a 4-year party, that kind of thing like that. So thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciated that too, Mike. And the part about ballot access is really important and critical. And I think that's one of the reasons why running for local offices is easier, because a lot of times the ballot access is the same for a library or city council. Even you either pay a fee or you get some petitions in lieu of a fee in most places. I know that that problem of getting a statewide race in Minnesota has been real for us. It takes 1% to become a minor party here, and now they've raised the threshold for major party, which means you really get ballot access for a major party. And so that's a motivator to run for president. Here we can run for any statewide race, though, and get that. So that is helpful. It would be great to see it more consistent around the whole country.